Thank you, Danny and Jason, for hosting this session, and thank you, Mickey and Carl, for giving a good introduction to basically the current state of how we're thinking about morphodynamics and actually the active process of submarine landslides. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here today, building on the first two talks, looking at internal deformation of submarine slides. How do they vary spatially? Well, I'm going to show you some evidence that the strength actually varies spatially too, and we may need to consider how that works to predict the onset of failure. And also looking at how the sediments initially started to fail based on the thickness, and Carl talked on that a little bit today, so a variability in slide thickness. So what do I want to show you today? The first point I think is pretty straightforward to everybody. I'm going to show some experimental results that the shear strength does increase with burial, and that's something that we need to consider when we're trying to understand how big these slides get and how they're going to evolve and either accelerate downslope rapidly or self-arrest. I'm also going to show some results on how much pressure is generated at the onset of failure, and this is important because it could lead to fluidization and accelerated runout of some slides. And the second point that I'm going to make today is that these strength and pressure parameters depend on the type of shear failure that we see in the slides. I'm going to show two different types of experiments, but you could go back to the first talk that Mickey showed different types of deformation internally within one slide. That may mean that we're generating pressure at different rates within those slides, and it may affect their ultimate runout length or the speed at which they failed. And related to that, I'm going to show very high pore pressures generated in thin failures or failures that happen at shallow depths, and that likely increases the failure mobility or how far these things are likely to run out as a fluidized sedimentary mass. We're going to study this looking at another IODP site, the Ursa region in the northern Gulf of Mexico. It's about 150 kilometers south of the Bird's Foot Delta of the Mississippi River, just on the eastern flank of the Mississippi Canyon. If we zoom in here and look at the stratigraphy or the seafloor, we're going to focus in on this transect going from approximately west to east. It's about 12 kilometers long, and it's about a kilometer of water depth. So we'll zoom in on that first. So these are the slides that we observe in the Ursa region, going from the west side to the central part and then back to the east. And we see, just as we saw in the first talk, that there are different styles of mobility or deformation internally within one slide. So on each of these, this is the seafloor coming here, along here, and right below the seafloor we see relatively layered, coherent materials. Each one of these panels, just for reference, is about 5 kilometers across and a few hundred meters in thickness, and we see, starting out with layered sediments on the top, not much recent failure in the last 20,000 years, but when we come down to depth we see this large mass transport complex or submarine landslide amalgamation in the Ursa region. It's about 20,000 years old. And on the west side, it's about 80 meters thick or so. And in the seismic data, we see variability in the deformation. We see these intact fault blocks outlined here, where if you zoom in and look at them, they actually show layered, coherent stratigraphy, not showing almost any deformation at all. Adjacent to that, we lose the coherent reflections. We see a lot of chaotic intervals, loss of reflectivity. What we think is that's remobilization of the sediment, massive folding, or potentially even complete restructuring of the sediment, indicating some kind of enhanced mobility and enhanced shear deformation at site U1324 and the west side of the margin. If we move to site U1323, looking at the same age sediments, we see a very different deformation pattern. Here's the base of the landslide deposit here. We actually see very brittle-like deformation, where we see all these sort of rotated domino-like fault blocks that show the paleo seafloor, what we think was happened at the time of failure, and very brittle faults going like that. And you actually see what looks like a fault bend fold, brittle type deformation, where this material is extending up here and then going up and over this ramp on the east side of the margin. So in the same age sediments, same compositional sediments, we have extremely well constrained grain size and mineralogy here. It's almost 65% clay-sized fraction, and most of that is smectite. So the same material, but very different deformation or failure behaviors. And we can infer from that probably different run-out behaviors. Moving farther to the east, at site U1322 that we also characterize, here's the base of that same landslide complex. Here's the top of that same landslide complex. And again, here we've lost almost all internal structure in that mass transport deposit. It's much thinner here, on the order of stacked 10 meter to 20 meter intervals, as compared to 100 meters over here and 80 meters over here. And we see almost all loss of internal structure. And what we've done from previous modeling work on the genesis of pressures is we inferred that there were higher pore pressures here, lower pore pressures here, and that impacted the failure type mechanisms from numerical modeling. Some laboratory work has been done to look at this too by Derek Sawyer and colleagues, where they set up Flume experiments. This is from their 2012 work, where they looked at what they called the flow factor, which are just the stresses that drive or encourage failure compared to the stresses that are resisting failure, and they tried to look at how the flow factor relates to the mobility that we see. So can we see what the material properties feed back to these long run-out discoordinate failures versus these blocky type rotations? On the left is a flume. Here's 20 centimeters for scale. And here's the flume where they generated the initial sedimentary mass and generated the failure. And we see that in this high flow factor, so we have either high driving stresses or low resisting stresses, low strengths in the material, they had a long run-out turbidity current. We lost all the initial stratigraphy, if you will, or layering in the original source, and redeposited in an unstructured manner this turbidity current. As you decrease the driving stresses or increase the resisting stresses, moving from left to right here, we see a blocky type rotation or blocky type failure, where we see intact blocks separated by discrete fault zones, similar to what we've seen in the seismic data. So they've shown that, and they can contour that up, showing that this going from high flow factor or high mobility to low mobility can be characterized as the clay size fraction and the volume of the rock that is occupied by pore fluids. And now what I want to do is try and look at, well, what's controlling this change in flow factor from a strength and pore pressure perspective. So we ran two types of experiments, direct simple shear experiments and triaxial experiments, to understand the strength and pore pressure evolution at the onset of failure at different stress levels in these clay-rich sediments from the Ursa Basin. In the direct simple shear experiments, we uniaxially jacket a sample, so we'd allow no lateral deformation, and we put it in the load frame. We apply a vertical consolidation stress to bring it up to the stress state that we want, simulating different burial depths, either shallow burial, intermediate burial, or deep burial. And here I'm looking at these landslide type burial depths of 4 or 5 meters up to 200 meters equivalent stresses. Once we reach the consolidation stress that we want, we apply a shear under undrained conditions. So we drive the sediment into failure by creating a lateral shear here. And in this DSS experiments, we have distributed shear throughout the entire sample, and we look at the strength of those materials under those conditions and the pore pressure response. We also run a series of triaxial experiments under the same general boundary conditions, but with different, same stress paths, but with different boundary conditions. So here we jacket our sample. We again uniaxially consolidate it to the stress level that we want, and then we apply an increase in axial stress and measure the shear stress that drives a localized failure in opposed to a distributed failure. So starting to think about how retrogressive scarps might behave versus internal deformation within the slides. And these are just some examples of the type of data we get from both experiments. We're looking here at shear stress as a function of shear strain. The shear stress goes up, it reaches a peak, and it rolls over. That's an example from the DSS. And this was a sample that was consolidated to a vertical consolidation stress of about 202 kilopascals. In triaxial, here we're looking in at shear stress versus strain. Again, we see this rapid increase in stress. We reach a peak value, and then it rolls over. We also get the pore pressures we do this. Now I'd like to show the results of some of those experiments. Here's our shear strength. The next 4 slides, the red dots will be the direct simple shear experiments. The blue dots will be our triaxial strength experiments, and they're all plotted as a function of consolidation stress from 0, or sitting at the seafloor, down to 2,000 kilopascals. For those of you who want to think about it in depth, we're going from near seafloor conditions, 0 burial depth, down to a hydrostatic equivalent depth of about 250 meters of burial. And we can look at how the peak shear stress evolves with different consolidation stress. And we see a nice general increase in the shear strength downhole in both sets of experiments. We can see how it really changes with burial depth by normalizing it and just looking at the shear strength relative to the burial depth or consolidation stress. And here we actually see some differences in what's going on. If we normalize that shear strength, like I mentioned, we see that the DSS experiments actually show a very high normalized shear strength. The shear strength is 60% of the overburden stress at very, very low burial depths, the few upper tens of meters. And there's a rapid decrease in that normalized strength. In the triaxial experiments, we again also see a slight decrease in that normalized shear strength with depth. And we think this is related to how the grains and pore structures are evolving with these two different types of failure. Just for reference here, this black line is what the driving stresses are today in the Ursa Basin. So we see that the strength significantly exceeds the driving stresses, so we're not in a failure type condition. We've done previous work on how to actually get these rocks to fail, and I'd be willing to talk to anybody about that during the break. We also get pore pressure measurements during the shear failure, so starting to think about once these materials fail, how does the pore pressure evolve, and how does that affect the mobility? Plotted in the same consolidation stress. Now we're looking at pressure on this axis. In the direct simple shear experiments, we see a rapid increase of pore pressure with increasing consolidation stress. And in the triaxial experiments, we actually start with a lower shear-induced pore pressure, similar to the DSS experiments, and a general increase in trend. But here we see a very different rate of change of the pressure in both environments. We can normalize this to think about how things are evolving relative to their depth. And we see that the pore pressures generated during shear in the DSS experiments actually increase from a value of about 0.6 up to a value of about 0.85 or 0.9 with burial depth. And what this means is in this upper section, if sediments have distributed shear, their pore pressure is increasing at a rate comparable to the overburden stress, or they're more likely to be liquefied, fluidized, and have long run-out distances. And this may actually be tied somewhat to some of the strain indicators that Mickey talked about earlier, that we can actually look at how much strain has been accumulated and how that may relate to the flow factor or the pressure generated during failure when it's distributed. When we look at the triaxial normalized pressure, it's approximately constant with depth. And so what we're seeing is if we distribute that shear deformation across the slide, we generate a lot more pore pressure in the system that promotes more failure and more runout, and that seems to be highly probable in shallow sediments. And then in the triaxial strength, where we're localizing the failure, the shear deformation is occurring on a smaller plane. We don't generate as much pore pressure, and maybe that leads to blockier or less runout. So now we're starting, those are the experiments, and starting to get us thinking about conceptually what might be going on and how to move this research forward in the future. And I'm starting to think about how these clays are originally deposited at the seafloor with a bunch of platy minerals generating flocks and separating, depositing on the seafloor, and we generate these large pore spaces within the flocks in the very, very shallow environment. And then as we start to shear fail these, when our driving stresses increase above our resisting stresses, we start to shear them and deform those very, very large pores. Those pores are weak, they want to collapse. That applies a pore pressure on the system, which feeds back into the failure. So our conceptual model is at low stresses, our electrostatic forces are very important, and that relates to the strength behavior that we're seeing. And it's the collapse of these very big pores, or the attempt to collapse these very big pores, that are generating shear pore pressures that compare to the overburden stress. As we consolidate things or bury them deeper, those pores get smaller and smaller. As we shear them, we again deform them. We're here under higher stresses. The electrostatic forces are becoming less important. The interparticle forces are becoming more important. And because the pore volume is smaller, we're actually generating a lower shear pore pressure. So as we bury them deeper, we're generating less pressure. There's less probability for them to have long run-out distances. So that's sort of the grain scale conceptual work that we're starting to think about. And then we can put it into a bigger picture where we think about as things are being deposited. Originally they're thin, they have relatively high strength relative to the driving stresses. They get thicker, and eventually they're mobilized and start running out over long distances. And we can think about maybe what the pore pressure is at these retrogressive head scarps, where it's more of a localized failure plane, or the deformation within the slide where it's distributed. And I'd like to end here just reiterating the key points that I showed, and lastly just talking about where we're going next to start looking at how these fabrics evolve during failure. We're going to expand the stress range to get overlap between the triax and DSX experiments, and also start looking at, in the shallow environment, the role of these electrostatic forces. Thank you very much.